So welcome to the Thailand Social Seminar Series, or as we are known as TS4. It is a seminar series sponsored by the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies, and the New York Southeast Asia Network. Now, this series brings together social science experts from across the globe to discuss pressing issues facing contemporary Thailand. My name is Petra Alderman, previously Desitova. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the International Development Department at the University of Birmingham and a research associate at the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies. And I'm going to be your host for this seminar today. Today we are going to hear from Ajahn Wasana Wongsurawat, who is an associate professor and chairperson of the Department of History, Faculty of Arts at Chulalongkorn University. So welcome to the seminar, Wasana.
Thank you. Hi.
The topic of today's seminar is Her Royal Highness Maha Chakri Sirindhorn and the PRC-Thai relations in the post-Cold War era. So this is a really exciting topic. Wasana will be talking for around 20 minutes, and then we will have around 25 minutes for the Q&A. So I would like to ask all our audience members to use the Q&A function within the webinar to post their questions, and then I will be asking the questions or throwing the questions at Wasana to answer. I guess it's time to start. So over to you, Wasana. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's very exciting. This is a project that came out of my year sabbatical in 2020. I think this is the first time I'm actually presenting it in a more formal academic setting. So I'm very excited. Thank you very much. And I look forward to get plenty of questions and comments from everyone. So yes, first of all, I would like to start out this first slide with two very important proposals. First of all, I believe I would like to propose that the end of the Cold War in Thailand, which ended with the victory of the conservative right-wing elite, ended basically with the establishment of formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in 1975. That was the key turning point in which I would say that was a point of no return. That was the point in which started the end. It was the beginning of the ending for the Communist Party of Thailand, and also for the left-wing student movement that had been active for much of the 70s, the early 70s. And 1975, I think Thailand's establishment of formal diplomatic relations with China in 1975 was also a point in which I would say the beginning point of the People's Republic of China replacing the United States as the overlord of mainland Southeast Asia, at least. People started seeing this in the 21st century, but I would like to say that it actually started in 75. And the beginning of this establishment of this relations between the People's Republic of China and Thailand was not only initiated by the conservative right elite in Thailand, but also driven largely by the palace. And one very important personality in driving this relationship is Her Royal Highness Princess Maha Chakri Sirindhorn. And I would also like to say that the relationship that started out in the 1970s and the fact that the Thai right-wing conservative elite got on the China bandwagon way before everyone else is the reason that allowed Thailand by the 21st century to be the only country in Southeast Asia once again to de-democratize what do I mean by that? De-democratize, in the sense that, and I'll talk about this later in my presentation, that in the 1990s, you see this wave of democratization going across the Asia Pacific in South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand as well. But Thailand happens to be the only country that seemed to have been democratizing in the 90s to then de-democratize and return to military dictatorship in the 21st century. And the root cause of that is what we're talking about here, the relations between Thailand and the People's Republic of China, in which was driven forward very strongly by Her Royal Highness Princess Maha Chakri Sirindhorn, and I will talk about that today. Okay, so this is just a timeline of what was going on in the 1970s. And what is not on here, first of all, is that 1969, Richard Nixon came out with the Nixon Doctrine, the Vietnamization of the war, and sort of sending a message that the US is going to eventually pull out of Vietnam. And this sort of sent a shock wave across Southeast Asia, especially the US's closest ally, which was Thailand. And that put in motion a lot of changes that were taking place in the 1970s. And there's 1973, of course, there's the October 14 student movement that resulted in the collapse of the Thanom Prapat Narong military dictatorship that had been in control of the country for the past decade. 1973 was also the year that Princess Sirindhorn first enrolled as an undergraduate student at the Faculty of Arts, majoring in history, by the way. So this is an interesting thing. Princess Sirindhorn is the same generation as what we call the Octoberists. They were her classmates in October 14 movement, and also the October 6 massacre at Thammasat University, because October 6, I mean, in 1976 was the year that she graduated from Chulalongkorn University. And during this time, it's very interesting because if you look at the student movement in 1973, they were hugely influenced by the Maoist ideology. It was very clear that they were very impressed by what was going on with what they've heard of the Cultural Revolution in China. And in 1974, they had this big exhibition on Red China at Thammasat University. And then 1975, we have the US's pulling out of Vietnam, the fall of Saigon, the end of the Vietnam War, and the establishment of diplomatic relations between Thailand and China by the right-wing Prime Minister, Mom Ratchawong Kukrit Pramod. And then in 76, there's the October 6 massacre. Now, what is interesting is that 76 is also the end of the Cultural Revolution. October 6 is actually also the date that the Gang of Four was arrested, and that paved the way for Deng Xiaoping's ascension to paramount power in China. And November 1976, just about a month after the October 6 incident, Princess Sirindhorn published one of her most well-known poems. It was first published in French, but then it has since been translated into English and Thai. And it's probably one of the most republished and the most quoted writings of Princess Sirindhorn ever. And this is the poem Le Pas de mon père, the footsteps of my father. And this is very interesting because it basically is a story about, I mean, it's a poem about how King Bhumibol Rama IX would travel to every last wilderness corner of Thailand and try to like alleviate the sufferings of the people at that time and help the poor people and help the peasants and whatnot. And I think this is a very strong statement, considering that it came up just about a month after the October 6 massacre, that she believes that the monarchy, the institution of the monarchy, is Thailand's savior from the communists in the Cold War, and that she stands with the monarchy and she supports King Bhumibol Rama IX. So this was, so I think her stance in the Cold War came very clearly from 1976 onwards. 2 years later, Deng Xiaoping made his first tour in Southeast Asia as the paramount leader of the People's Republic of China. And his first stop was Bangkok, Thailand, and he had a private audience with King Bhumibol Rama IX, Queen Sirikit, and the only royal offspring there present in that meeting was Princess Sirindhorn. And during that visit, Deng Xiaoping also participated in the ordination of the then Crown Prince Maha Chulalongkorn, who is now Rama X. So that visit more or less presented to all the Thai people that China is not a threat anymore. China is not against the monarchy. China is not against Buddhism, and so on and so forth. At that time, Princess Sirindhorn was doing her master's degree at Chulalongkorn University. In 1980, she finished her master's degree and she started learning the Chinese language. In 1981, she visited China for the first time. It was a state visit. She was representing the head of state, King Bhumibol Rama IX. And in that same year, she would return and publish her first travel memoir to China called Treading the Dragon's Land, or Yam Dan Mangkorn. 1981 is also the year that she started teaching her career as a history lecturer at Chulalongkorn Royal Military Academy, so the Thai Army Academy, and she would be in that position until retirement just a few years ago. And this is very important because I see two very important bases of her influence in Thailand. One is the Faculty of Arts, Chulalongkorn University, as the intellectual base, and she has friends who later became professors and deans of the Faculty of Arts. And the other very important base is Chulalongkorn Royal Military Academy within the military, so that everyone who graduated from Chulalongkorn Royal Military Academy since the 1980s would have at one point studied with Princess Sirindhorn, including the people who are in the government right now. Okay, and then we get to the late 1980s and 1990s. As I mentioned before, the 1990s was a time of this wave of democratization across the Asia Pacific. And I think one major reason for that is the receding of US influence and the fact that the Cold War is over and there's really no reason for the US to continue to support military dictators in the region. And so we see a wave of democratization across the region. Thailand itself had the first elected prime minister in Chathai Chunawan in 1989. 1989 was also the year that the Tiananmen massacre took place on June 4th. And the following year, 1990, is very interesting. In April, less than a year after the Tiananmen massacre, Princess Sirindhorn made her second state visit to the People's Republic of China and visited the Xinjiang Uyghur region. And when she returned, she published her second travel memoir, Forward Afar Amidst the Sand Streams, Mung Klai Nai Roi Sai. This is a major statement by Her Royal Highness because at this time, of course, there was no serious sanctions from the world against China because of the Tiananmen massacres, but no head of state would visit China at that time. At least they would condemn China, or at least they would just stay away from China. So the fact that she represented the head of state and she visited China less than a year after the Tiananmen massacre, this really established her as a special friend of China and established Thailand as a special friend of China as well. And in the 1990s, you would see there's almost a decade between the first visit in 81 and the second visit in 90. But in the 1990s, she would make many more state visits, more than 10 state visits in the 1990s. There would be 8 travel memoirs, there would be 2 novels, 2 poetry collections during this time. And this was really the point that Princess Sirindhorn was establishing herself as, you know, the foremost China hand of this country. 1991 was the coup that overthrew the Thai regime. And then 1992 was the Bloody May incident. This is very interesting because the Bloody May incident in May of 1992 ended very much like the 14 October situation, in which there was bloodshed, and then the king came on TV, and then the coup prime minister resigned, and then the king appointed a caretaker prime minister, and everything was supposed to be okay, and we were supposed to be a democracy after that. And many people thought that that was the last coup. That would be the last coup in Thailand, 1991, because people came out and presented that they were not taking this. Bangkokians were not supporting this at all. And so we all thought that would have been the last coup. 1993 was the establishment of the Thai Chinese Cultural and Economic Association, TCCEA. You can Google this. It's called the Cultural and Economic Association, but if you look at the objectives, the number one objective of this association is to be the closest link between the Thai and Chinese armed forces. And the first Thai chairperson of the TCCEA was General Chawalit Yongchayut, who was the Thai army chief and would later become prime minister in 1996 to 1997. And this association is still running today. And if you look it up and see the membership, you would see a wide variety of businesses, the military, intellectuals. It's almost like who's who in Thailand. And this shows the heightened connections between the Thai military and the Chinese military. Okay. Yes, I'm running out of time. So look a bit at the travel memoirs. Between 1981 and 2008, Princess Sirindhorn published 13 travel memoirs to China. This is the highest number. She publishes a lot of travel memoirs everywhere she goes, but most countries get 1 or 2. The number 2 country with the largest number of travel memoirs is Laos, 6 memoirs. So you see very clearly that she's more interested in China than other places. These memoirs would include accounts not only of her traveling, but her meetings with CCP top leaders. And I listed the kind of leaders that she met. So prime ministers, vice president, president. So by the way, she's the only, I think, top personality in Thailand to have met with all the paramount leaders of China since Deng Xiaoping to the present. However, the leader that she seems to have met most frequently and appears most frequently in her memoirs was Li Peng, who appeared 5 times. And even after he retired, they had a personal meeting. So she also, because she would report her meetings and dinings with these Chinese leaders, she would also report the conversation they have. And a lot of time this would be presenting China's, the CCP perspective on things. Like when she went to Tibet, there was this long, like 10 pages of like why Tibet has always been part of China, for example, or the one on the Hong Kong handover. There was a very long narrative of, the evils of British imperialism and all that that we see in these memoirs. Aside from memoirs, she also translated a lot of works of literature. So between 1994 and 2022, she translated altogether 13 pieces of of literature, mostly novels, but there's some collections of poetry as well. The themes of these literature that she translated is also very interesting, because a lot of them are scar literature. They talk about the horrors of the Cultural Revolution. And I think this is important because the message is kind of like the dangers of the revolution. And as I mentioned, she is the Octoberist generation, and her classmates were very enamored by the Cultural Revolution. So I kind of see this as a statement that, like, she who has become the expert on China is telling you that even China doesn't like the revolution. Even China thinks that the revolution is a mistake. And together with that, to support that, there's also stories of the great accomplishments of the open and reform policies. And another very interesting aspect, there were 4 novels between 2012 and 2016 that were on the theme of Chinese feminism and the modern family, which we can definitely talk more about that later. Okay, so where that leaves us today? So we see very clearly that Princess Sirindhorn has become the sort of foremost personality, impersonation of personification of PRC-Thai relations. In 2009, she made the top 10 list of China's best friends by popular vote. 2019, she received the Friendship Medal, which is the highest award given to foreigners from President Xi Jinping. And in 2022, she became the first representative of the head of state to attend the opening of both the Summer and Winter Olympics in Beijing. She went in 2008 and she went again in 2022. In 2022, it was also reported on the website of the Chinese embassy in Bangkok that she reported to Foreign Minister Wang Yi that she was working on the history of the accomplishments of the Chinese Communist Party in Thai. So that might be her next publication, which I'm very much looking forward to. But anyway, with all this, and we look at the context of what has been going on, Thailand's military government since the latest coup in 2014 has very clearly continuously shifted closer to the PRC than the US. And we have very interesting developments. Thailand has become the origins of the Milk Tea Alliance. And we have pro-democracy activists working together with activists in Hong Kong and Taiwan and so on and so forth, and relating to the movements in Myanmar as well. And so I think, yes, I think we can talk more about this in the Q&A, but for now, I guess I would like to end here. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for a very exciting and interesting presentation. If I could ask you to stop sharing the screen so that we can,
okay.
Perfect, so we could see each other a bit better. So I would like to, at this point, to invite the participants to start posing questions into the Q&A. But I think I might just abuse my position of chairing this seminar first and shoot the first question right at you. So you mentioned that this relationship between Princess Sirindhorn and the People's Republic of China in some way kind of contributed to de-democratization of Thailand. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that particular point. Where do you see that, you know, as really contributing, and how?
Well, there are several things. First of all, we see after the coup of 2006 and after the coup of 2014, China was basically the only superpower to say, okay, it's your domestic affairs, we're not going to intervene and all that. Whereas the EU and the US and Australia and everyone says that this is not good, you should return to democracy and all that, right? And if you look at the, I have followed some the news about the visits of the Thai leaders, especially the military leaders, to China, and the deals, armed deals and other sort of deals between the Thai military and the Chinese military. It's very clear that that there is this closer relationship that came about after the coup, especially after the coup in 2014, so in the past decade. And there's also been a narrative, I think, since the 1997 financial crisis, we start hearing the narrative of how capitalism is evil and politicians are corrupted. And we also hear the rise of sufficiency economy, this narrative that came out, towards the end of the 1990s, and grew and grew and grew and grew in the 2000s and 2010s as well. And if I got this idea from reading the travel memoirs, a lot of the travel memoirs that Her Royal Highness published, you see the competition, the comparisons between the developmental projects of the Chinese Communist Party and the royal projects. And the narrative in the literatures that she translates, there's also this idea that democracy is really not that important. It's important that you have a righteous ruler, and the righteous ruler would impose righteous policies, and things would be okay. And you should try and resolve all the problems at the individual level, and you shouldn't try and change the government for that. Individuals can make a difference if you just do your job and all that. And that narrative, it jives very well with the narrative of movements like the PRC that came out and called for the coup in 2014, for example. And you see a lot of parallels going on in the justification of the power of the Chinese Communist Party after the open and reform policy in 1978, and what was going on by these undemocratic regimes in Thailand up to the present.
Yeah, definitely. So we've now got a few questions from the audience rolling in. So let me just take this first question. And this one is basically saying that in the past year, we could see Thailand shifting a little bit more in its sort of foreign diplomatic focus from China to the US. And how much influence do you think does Princess Sirindhorn have on the Thai foreign policy, within the current administration?
I would say since the COVID lockdown, we have heard very little from her. But I have a kind of quasi personal story, in that in January of 2022, there's the birthday of the Faculty of Arts, and we have to go and give food to the monks at the faculty. And she would always come and join because she is an alumna of the Faculty of Arts. And she asked me what I was researching on. And I said, oh, I'm working on Your Highness's works that influence the Thai society's perception of China. And she said, oh, I'm stopping doing anything. I'm not doing things on China anymore. And I'm not even teaching Chinese history at the military academy. I'm switching to teach European history. And there's only one translation that is still, in publication process, and it will come out in 2 weeks, and I'll send it to you. But after, I'm not doing anything related to China anymore. So I took it as her telling me that my work is obsolete, but by that. And so I found it really interesting that later on, when she went to Beijing for the opening of the Winter Olympics, the Chinese embassy reported that she said that she was writing a book on the accomplishments of the Chinese Communist Party in Thai, so the Thai people can learn about that. So, and this news is only published in the Chinese language. It's not seen anywhere in the Thai language press. So I feel that is interesting. I think that, you know, kind of it has become very clear that, especially since the COVID disaster of the Thai government insisting on using Sinovac as the main vaccine for such a long time, it's very clear that after this COVID disaster, that China's position in the Thai public opinion is very low. It's much lower than it was before COVID. So I think at the moment we don't hear so much about Her Royal Highness's relations with China in the press.
On that one thing that you mentioned there, I was going to ask how influential actually are her writings? Like, are Thai people actually reading them, or you know, does it really have much of an audience?
This is very interesting because there are like tens of copies in all the libraries, right? It's very easy to get hold of her writings, but I seem to be the first person to borrow them, all of them, from the libraries. So I don't think a lot of people read them. I think a lot of people buy them and give them as gifts, awards, or whatever, but I don't think it's very popular. The later ones, especially, I think in the 1990s, it was very important because in the 1990s, it was still before the internet became a thing in Thailand. And so this, her travel memoirs were the largest body of writings in the Thai language about China. So if you wanted to know about China, that's where to go. Yeah. So, but since the 2000s, since people are Googling about things in Thailand, I don't think they are very popular, but their continuous appearance, you know, publication and these travel memoirs, they're published like 15 times, 20 times, 40 times, right? It's amazing. Show a very clear, send a very clear message that Her Royal Highness is in favor of the People's Republic of China. And Her Royal Highness is definitely the most popular personality in the Thai royal family at the present and for a long time. And so the fact that she likes China, I think for a long time makes the criticism of China and the relations between Thailand and China almost a taboo. And that's why the Milk Tea Alliance is such a big deal, because this was something that you didn't want to talk about, because, you know, if Her Royal Highness likes China, China must be good. Yes, that's my answer to that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting insight. We've got another question that it's basically touching on a bit of a shift between the alliances. So the question goes, you know, during the Cold War, the US was actually the superpower that was supporting the Thai royal family. But then, you know, after the end of the Cold War, as you were sort of saying, it seems that the shift of the royal family, at least from the position of the princess, is more towards China. So what was the key factor, you know, if you can try to elaborate in this kind of switch of the Thai royal family from maybe aligning themselves more with China after the Cold War?
I think a large part about Princess Sirindhorn's relations with China in the beginning, in the 1980s and 1990s, I think was still a very academic, intellectual thing. Another member of the royal family who went to China quite a bit in the 80s was Princess Kalayani Watana, who was the King Bhumipon's older sister. And she has this persona of the intellectual as well. And Princess Sirindhorn also has this persona of the intellectual as well. So I think it started out as kind of like intellectual exchanges, and in her travel memoirs, when she would go to China, she would bring along her university professor friends from Chulalongkorn University and Thammasat University, and they would come and they would have conversations, intellectual conversations about things, and China experts, and it would be almost like reading a history book at some point. So I think it was presented in this like harmless intellectual exchange at the beginning, and I think in you don't see the shift from the US to China very clear in the 1990s yet. I think you only start to see it very clearly after the coups. First the coup in 2006 and the coup in 2014. And then after the coup in 2014, it's very clear that maybe not the royal family, but the military government is very clearly shifting towards China. And then you look back and you see that all this, right, the groundwork has been laid through the 1990s already. So they're at a position to like, justify their shifting towards China because China is our friend, because China is good, because Princess Sirindhorn likes China.
We've got another question here saying that in your previous book, you were dealing, among other things, with the question of how Siamese monarchs adjusted Siam's relationship with China after the end of the tributary relationship in the second half of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. Is it too simplistic to say that the Thai monarchy is now leading a movement to restore a kind of neo-tributary relationship with China?
No, I wouldn't categorize it that way. In my first book, actually, the takeaway from my first book that I would like everyone to get is that there's this myth, right, about how Thailand is the only country in Southeast Asia not to be colonized, right? So my proposal in that book was that the reason why Thailand was not colonized was because the elite pretended to be British colonial officers. So it's a patron-client relation between external superpower and the Thai elite, right? And the Thai elite is very skillful in switching patrons, right? So during the colonial period, they had a patron that was most powerful in the colonial period, and that's Great Britain. And then during the Cold War, of course, they switched to the US, right? Because that's the most powerful external superpower. But then when the US seemed to be pulling out after the Nixon Doctrine and after the fall of Saigon and all that, then they have to find a new superpower patron that would support their stance. And that was China. So I see China replacing the US during the Cold War, rather than what is happening now being, a kind of modern day tributary relations. I see this as an ongoing colonial relation that has been going on since the mid-19th century with the British.
Then we have another question, and to sort of take you back to the period of 1976 to 1980, when so many Thai students actually joined the Communist Party of Thailand at the time when China was still supporting the party and the armed struggle in Thailand. But also after 1975, when Thailand had established diplomatic relations with PRC. How did Princess Sirindhorn position herself at this time in regards to these relations?
Well, I mentioned the poetry, right? The footstep of my father, right? Le pas de mon père. You can Google that and read it, and you would see very clearly that she idolizes her father, King Bhumibol, and she presents her father as like working so hard for his people and, to save the people from poverty, from violence, from war, from whatever. And that poem was published in November of 1976. So I think her stance, that's declaring her stance very clearly, that her stance is not with the student movement of the time. Her stance is that the monarchy is necessary for Thailand's survival through the Cold War. And I think that stance has never changed. And in later on in her writings about China, it's very interesting when we read her, when I read her travel memoirs, and there's instances of her talking to the top leaders of China, and they're talking about their projects. They're going to, develop the country in this way and that way. And I always felt that it was strange that you hardly ever see her comparing the Chinese government with the Thai government. It's always the Chinese president with the king. So it's drawing this, it's you read it and you get the feeling that the king is the Thai leader. Whereas I'm reading that and I'm like, wait, we have parliament, we're supposed to have elections and all that, but the narrative is the parallels that are drawn in her travel memoirs show this perception very clearly, I think.
Another question, and this is sort of taking a little bit back to the de-democratization argument. And the question really is about, you've asserted that Thailand went through a period of de-democratization, following Thaksin's rise, so that's sort of in the 2000s, particularly after the 2006 military coup, and then the Sino-Thai relations played obviously a part. But the question is really, would you mind elaborating a little bit more of why do you believe that this has really played a part and not some other reasons, such as the monarchy's fear of Thaksin, that really contributed to Thailand sort of going back on some of the more democratic gains made in the 90s?
Of course, Thaksin was a big factor of everything, right? But my point of view is that there has been a continuous effort from the 70s onwards. And as I mentioned, right after, I would say the Bloody May incident in 1992 was a failure of the coup in 1991. Because if you look at this, Thai was elected, right? Thai is the first elected prime minister, right? After Prem for so long. And they were unhappy with him. And so there was a coup, and it was supposed to be, and then the coup government would go on, right? But there was such a huge uproar that, okay, the coup didn't work, and there had to be the Bloody May incident and all that. And so in 1993, after the Bloody May incident, you have the establishment of the TCCEA. You have the military continuing to build bridges and contacts and everything with the Chinese military. And I think, I'm not saying that China caused the de-democratization in Thailand. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the relationship with China allowed for an excuse to go back to military dictatorship. The relationship with China, the promotion of how awesome China is. Look, China has become the second largest economy in the world, and it doesn't need democracy, and it just needs capable rulers. And, politicians are corrupted, and capitalism is evil, and the IMF is bad, and the IMF is the US, and and the World Bank is the US and all that. So we should like China more, because China is not the IMF, and China doesn't mind if we're a military dictatorship. So what I'm saying is that the attempt to de-democratize, I see being an attempt of the right-wing elite. And when I say the right-wing elite, I mean the conservative political factions, I mean the military and the palace. there has been this concerted effort for a long time already, but China's influence and the relationship with China sort of facilitates and lends credibility to that move towards de-democratization.
Yeah, it's a very sort of interesting take, and I think, you know, there's a lot in that that can be elaborated on. We've got many more questions than we can probably. I've just been scrolling up and down through the questions, trying to pick the ones that might fit into our time. So I'm very sorry if we don't answer all the questions, because we do have many more questions than we can actually answer. But there's another interesting question that asks whether Princess Sirindhorn actually discusses matters related to religion and minorities in China. How does she discuss these kind of issues? I mean, you have already touched upon issues like Tibet, but how about Falun Gong or Xinjiang and these kind of contentious issues? Has there been anything?
Well, everyone should read the book on Xinjiang, Mung Klai Nai Roi Sai, which was published in 1990, right? And this was the famous second trip that happened less than a year after Tiananmen, right? And you read it and you're like, oh, this is awesome. Like, you know, the Uyghurs are very happy, and the Chinese government worked very hard to like help all these people be happy. And there's like traditional dresses, traditional dancing and everything. So yeah, like I said, it's almost, I read it and I feel like, what is this CCP propaganda or what, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I kind of feel like, maybe you don't need, because a lot of these travel memoirs is about her visiting museums and what is in the museum and the history, right? But then but then you have like conversations over dinner with the local leaders or something, and then you suddenly have 6 pages of how great the Chinese Communist government has been in Xinjiang and things like that. So no, there is no critical statement about the CCP's policies at all. There's only one incident which is very interesting, was a trip that she made to the northeast of China, Manchuria, and the local government, of course, would have to take her to the most important historical sites. And the most important historical site, one of the most important historical site, was the palace of the puppet emperor, right? So Pu Yi's palace when he was the emperor of Manchukuo. And there's all this history about how evil the Qing dynasty was, and how evil the monarchy was, and how bad everything was, and you know, Pu Yi had to be re-educated and all that, right? And then of course, so she's trying to recount the story, right? Because they were telling her all this, but there was a very long disclaimer at the end of that section where she says, well, it's happened a long time ago, and you know, you can look at history from many points of views, and you should probably not like judge anyone too harshly, and you shouldn't take this seriously anyways, because it's just me writing and things like that, right? So it's kind of, so this is the only time in the 13 books that I read that she kind of, you know, tried to neutralize or try to disagree with what was presented to her, because of course it was very anti-monarchic kind of statement. Yeah. So that
indeed, yeah. I think from this seminar you might inspire people to go and read her travel seminar.
Yes, everyone should read it. It's eye-opening, totally. Yeah, she can sell more books too, I think.
So far we've been concentrating primarily on the relationship between the royal family, or the princess, and the Chinese government, but there is a question sort of asking when we look at the broader elites, and specifically Thaksin and that elite group and their alliance with China. So could you maybe elaborate on that kind of relationship? I mean, is there any kind of contrast between the two? Is it, you know, one is pro, the other one is against? Or
yes, this is a very good question. Because the Chinese Communist Party does not put all its eggs in one basket. So only because I'm giving a talk about Princess Sirindhorn and her relations with China does not mean that Thaksin does not have a relation with China. Thaksin also has a very good relationship with China. And if Thaksin or his party would return to be the government, they would have a very good, they would work with China. They would want to work with China. So I think, so China also had a good working relationship with Thaksin and the following governments that were seen as his nominees as well. But the difference is that Thaksin was elected, right? And so, and I actually heard this being said by colleagues coming from China to Thailand and complaining that, you know, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, the Thai government changed like a revolving door, right? So it's very difficult for China to make any long-term plans or invest in like mega projects or whatever with Thailand, because it's this instability caused by changes of governments all the time, right? And this is yet another excuse for military dictatorship, that, like, you know, if only you could have one prime minister for 8 years, that would be good, right? And we have it now, and it's not so great anyways. But yeah, so it's, China could definitely work with an elected government, but it's quite obvious. I mean, there are empirical evidence that China works better with undemocratic governments, and the case of Thailand is like that as well. But I have no question at all if there really is an election later this year or next year, and if we have a new government led by Prayuth party or something, the Prayuth Thai prime minister would still be try to cultivate a very good relationship with China. It's a business.
Well, yeah, I'm afraid we only have time for one very quick question, and that's going to be a final question. So apologies for all the other brilliant questions that we didn't get round to. But will your research and the things that you've been talking about today during the seminar be published in some form in Thailand or abroad, that, you know, people who are interested could actually read and learn more on what you've been doing?
Thank you. I'm working on, I have a manuscript already, but it probably has to be revised quite a bit, because she published a few more translations since 2020. So I plan to have my second book called tentatively The Crown and the Communists. So the first book is The Crown and the Capitalists, right? So my second book would be The Crown and the Communists, and it would focus on the relationship between the Crown and the Chinese Communist Party. And yes, I would definitely publish it outside of Thailand, because I don't think at this point it's safe to publish in Thailand. Yeah, and hopefully it should be out in a couple of years.
Perfect. So we'll definitely keep an eye out for that book. And also we will keep an eye out for your work and future work as well, because obviously this is super fascinating. And yeah, I'm afraid we've run out of time, so I would just like to say thank you very much for joining us today and for talking about this very fascinating issue, and giving us you know, a lot more food for thought, really, and also probably adding to our summertime reading lists in terms of very interesting publications and really a kind of insight into Thailand's historical relations from slightly different perspective. So Wasana, once again, thank you so much for your for joining us today. If I could quickly ask you, would you mind sharing your screen with the last, if you kept the last slide with information for the next seminar? I believe there should be some information.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, so our next seminar will happen on the 15th of September. So for those of you who would like to join, please do go and register for this seminar, because we will be having Professor Alan Hicken, who's going to be talking about living in interesting times, patterns and problems in contemporary Thai politics, which should be another interesting webinar that we have in this series. So once again, thank you very much. Thank you to all our participants and for all the brilliant questions, and see you again in September. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.